Good day. Today is Tuesday, 1st April 2025. We're into the month of April, and tomorrow, 2nd April, according to President Trump, is Liberation Day, the day when tariffs are going to be imposed on trade with many countries around the world, most countries in fact, and it's been viewed with hope by some, at least in the United States, trepidation by many, many others. Perhaps the most interesting development of all in relation to the fact that tariffs are being imposed by the United States is that three Asian countries, three very unlikely Asian countries, China, Japan, and South Korea, have apparently had a meeting with each other to discuss how to respond to these incoming American sanctions. Given how difficult relations between China and Japan have become over the last few years, it's really quite an achievement in some respects to bring these three countries together. South Korea, of course, has been going through a political crisis ever since the president of South Korea attempted to dissolve parliament and institute martial law. That political crisis, so far as I can see, is far from resolved. But Japan, which has had a new prime minister recently, has had tense relations with China for a long time. But all three countries are major exporters to the United States, and all three countries, China, Japan, and South Korea, are obviously going to be jointly affected by the sanctions. And they appear to be in discussions with each other on finding some means to mitigate the effect of the sanctions on their economies by increasing their trade with each other. Now, this takes us back quite a long time to a period when I can remember that China had become one of Japan's major markets and trading partners. Of course, a lot of Japanese companies still do extensive business with China. But with China now the colossus of the three, it seems that Japan and South Korea are having to recalibrate their economic relations and are having to look again at whether maybe they need to improve their economic arrangements with China in a way that inevitably, I suspect, over time is going to change their perspective on their geopolitical relations with the United States. Now, China has, for its part, also responded to the various comments by President Trump that in the event that Trump decides that the Russians are dragging their feet on a ceasefire or on a general peace in the conflict in Ukraine, he will impose tariffs on countries that buy additional further tariffs on countries that import Russian oil. And the Chinese government has been extremely careful not to respond to these comments, but we've had statements about it from the Chinese media. The China Daily, for example, has said that Russian officials are treating these comments mostly as a bluff, but that in the event that the United States does go ahead and impose such tariffs on countries like China, India, and others that import Russian oil, the effect will be to damage the relations between these countries and the United States. So it doesn't look as if the Chinese are in any mood to bend to the Americans on this question. They're still committed to forging closer political and economic relations with Russia, even as they're trying to mend their fences with some of their Asian neighbors, Japan and South Korea. Now, I say all of this because none other than the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, is currently in Moscow. And Wang Yi, of course, is not just China's foreign minister. He also fulfills simultaneously the role of Xi Jinping's national security advisor, and he is also a member of the Chinese Communist Party's Politburo, though he is not, as I understand it, a member of the standing committee of the Politburo, the inner ring of top leaders who ultimately make the decisions together with Xi Jinping. But anyway, Wang Yi is now one of the most experienced practitioners of foreign policy in the world. He's become an almost permanent fixture in global diplomacy. He's forged over several years now, many years now, a very close relationship. One could even call it a partnership with his Russian opposite number, Sergei Lavrov, and he is in Moscow. And he's apparently in Moscow for 3 days, and it's anticipated that he will meet all the key people in Moscow. He's already had meetings with Lavrov, and it's expected that he will shortly meet with Putin himself and probably with Putin's national security advisor, Sergei Lavrov. And for all I know, he might also meet Ushakov, the Putin's foreign policy advisor, who is the point man, the person who is ultimately in charge of the diplomacy with the Trump administration and with the United States. And alongside Wang Yi's visit to Russia, there have been all sorts of statements about how the relationship between China and Russia has never been stronger. There's how it will continue to develop and grow stronger still. There's reports that Wang Yi has said, apparently in discussions with Lavrov, that there is, well, if no, I don't know whether the expression no limits partnership is still being used, but anyway, that this is a partnership that remains the priority for both of these countries, which, by the way, I believe to be true, both for the Chinese and the Russians. And it does look as if both the Chinese and the Russians are going out of their way for the moment to emphasize, to make clear to the world that their relations remain as strong as ever. Now, this is an interesting moment in Russian-Chinese relations because the Russians, until very recently, have been the country under the most pressure by the United States. As I discussed in my program yesterday, the New York Times has published a massive article which basically confirms that which we have been saying on the Duran for a long time, Alex Christoforou and I, and what I discussed in my programs that I made on this channel, which is that the conflict in Ukraine, far from being a proxy war between the United States and Russia, has actually had much more of the quality of a direct war between the United States and Russia. The Americans have been commanding and running Ukrainian armies. They've been equipping them. They've been planning their military operations. They've been doing everything to fight this war in Russia, short of actually deploying their own armed forces. And the extent of American involvement may be the most interesting, a good example of how extensive American involvement is. It's to look again at the evolution of the weapons supplies provided to Ukraine, or nominally provided to Ukraine. So the New York Times tells us that shortly after the Russian the Russians began their special military operation. The United States supplied to Ukraine M777 howitzers, these with 15-mile range. And the Americans very quickly discovered, these were the American generals in place, Cavalry, Donahue, Milley, all of them quickly discovered that though these are indeed long-ranged artillery pieces, Russian headquarters and logistics bases were out of range of these artillery pieces. So, in the early summer of 2022, they began demands. They started to make demands to the United States, to President Biden, that in place, or rather together with the M777 howitzers, HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems should also be supplied to Ukraine. Now, I remember vividly the whole narrative that took place at that time. It was supposed to be Zelensky who was demanding the supply of these HIMARS systems. Supposedly, there was a telephone conversation between Biden and Zelensky in which very grudgingly and with all kinds of qualifications and conditions and caveats, President Biden agreed to supply the HIMARS systems. And I also remember at the time that the number of HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems which were going to be supplied was put at, if I remember rightly, something like 24 or something of that kind. It didn't look as if an extensive or large-scale delivery was taking place. And of course, I, who was unaware of what was actually going on behind the scenes, did not realize that it was in fact the American generals who were commanding the Ukrainian forces, who were the real people who were asking for these HIMARS systems to be supplied to Ukraine. And I did assume that it was Zelensky, and I took some of the claims that the numbers of HIMARS systems that would be supplied would be limited to just 24. I took them seriously. All of that was a lie. It was the American generals who wanted them, and it's quite clear that the number of HIMARS systems that were supplied was much more extensive than reports suggested. Now, I've been reading accounts about numbers of Abrams tanks that have been destroyed or captured or disabled by the Russians in Ukraine. I noticed that, I recall that the original number of Abrams tanks supplied by the United States, or at least that we were told were being supplied by the United States, was 31. But the New York Times article speaks of the United States supplying, as I recall, 76 tanks in total. It doesn't tell us what type of tanks, but I've long wondered how it was possible that, given the number of Abrams tanks that had been disabled and destroyed, and verifiably disabled and destroyed, and in some cases captured by the Russians, there still seem to be so many Abrams tanks continuing in the fight. Well, I now believe, and I'm going to say it straightforwardly, that just as many more HIMARS missile systems were supplied to by the United States to Ukraine than I ever assumed, so I suspect that the same has been true about Abrams tanks. We probably haven't been provided with all the full details, but my guess is that we're going to learn that at least 70, probably more, of these tanks were supplied to Ukraine, again, at the assistance, I'm sure, of these American generals. Anyway, let's move on. The HIMARS proved effective for a few weeks, but the Russians quickly adjusted to the effect of the HIMARS. They dispersed their ammunition dumps and moved them back from the front lines, and they were also able to harden their headquarters and perhaps improve their security and put their headquarters beyond the range of the HIMARS systems. And then the same group of American generals who previously agitated and demanded the supply of the HIMARS systems, according to the New York Times, started to demand that ATACMS missiles with longer ranges, 190 kilometers, should be supplied as well, so as to reach further behind Russian lines to attack these logistics bases and these headquarters. And the Pentagon resisted. The Pentagon didn't want to do this at all. They were worried about the depletion of American reserves of this limited stockpile of ATACMS missiles. But eventually the Biden administration agreed, and hundreds of ATACMS missiles were supplied and were used. All, by the way, both the HIMARS and the ATACMS, fully under American control. American controllers guided the launch of these systems, selected the targets, programmed the missiles, basically ran the entire operation. All of these ATACMS were supplied, as I said in a previous article. The New York Times said that around 500 ATACMS missiles were supplied nominally to Ukraine, but shall we say rather to the American-Ukrainian coalition forces fighting the war in Ukraine. And, well, as we've seen, they've been used many times in the war, but they've hardly achieved anything permanent or significant, and they've never managed to change the overall picture of the war. So this is a further example of how over the last 3 years it has been Russia which has been the country of the two countries of the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership. It has been Russia which has been under the most intense pressure. The Americans have been waging this conflict, effectively this war against Russia on its western borders and in Ukraine. The Americans have led a massive program of economic warfare against Russia. That is what the sanctions have amounted to. And, well, they've been more than just sanctions. They've been essentially an all-out declaration of economic war on Russia. And the pressure on Russia over the last 3 years has been enormous, exceptional, something far beyond anything that we saw at any point during the Cold War. And the Russians, as I've discussed, have withstood that pressure, and undoubtedly the fact that China maintained economic relations with them throughout this period of the 3 years when they were under this extraordinary pressure, well, that undoubtedly has played a significant role in helping the Russians to come through. Now, it looks as if, as I discussed in my program yesterday, it will be China's turn. The United States, with all its allies, with all of the help of its allies, its European allies, has failed to break Russia. But the major adversary has always been identified as China, and the pressure is now going to be switched to China. Now here I think, again, I want to make a particular point. I don't think President Trump himself is looking for a conflict with China. I think his own primary focus is not China at all, but his own desires to carry out root and branch changes within the United States itself. He is deeply suspicious of China's economic activities. He believes that Chinese exports have played a central role in hollowing out America's industrial base, and he wants to reverse that. Probably, like many others in the United States, he's persuaded himself that China's growing scientific and technological prowess is based on stealing concepts and ideas and technology from the United States, a view, by the way, which I consider to be completely untrue. But nonetheless, and despite that, he still, I think, would prefer to avoid an outright conflict. He's not looking for war. He's not looking for war with Taiwan, over Taiwan, or anything like that. In fact, my impression is that he doesn't particularly like Taiwan or the Taiwanese authorities. He sees Taiwan as another Asian country that has exploited the generosity of the United States. But others in his administration clearly take a much more hardline view, and we see that there's now talk, as I discussed in my program yesterday, about the United States refocusing almost entirely its military forces to contest China, to defend Taiwan, which has now achieved a kind of psychological, political importance in the minds of some people in the United States, which is similar to what Ukraine achieved around 10 years ago, just saying. So focusing on defending Taiwan, and of course we have lots of talk about the first and second island chains in the Pacific and all of that, and preparing for some kind of military conflict with China. Trump himself may not seek it, but others within his administration, if they don't exactly seek it, they act as if they do, and they also act as if they believe that it is inevitable, that it will happen. And just to say, given that the United States has waged what is essentially a covert war against Russia, a nuclear superpower, and has been doing so for 3 years, and has so far managed to avoid having that conflict escalate into an all-out nuclear exchange. The New York Times article goes into some lengths as to the way in which the US tried to avoid letting things grow to that particular level. I suspect that there are military people in the United States who believe that with China, which has a much smaller nuclear arsenal than Russia does, albeit one that is growing rapidly, I think they believe that they may be able to do the same thing, that they might be able to wage a conventional war against China without seeing it escalate all of the way up to a nuclear conflict. So the Chinese have to think about that. But they have to think about something much more immediate and much more obvious, and that is the economic pressure that is being piled on against them. And so far, the United States has experimented and dabbled with sanctions against China, and it has imposed some sanctions, including some secondary sanctions against China, but it has not yet gone into all-out economic war against China by imposing the kind of sweeping sanctions that the United States and its European allies imposed against Russia. But We are now quite close to that point when it looks likely that the United States is going to do something which, even if it is not presented as the same, even if it is not conceptually the same, even if in the mind of its maker, Donald Trump, it is completely different. It is going to have similar or at least analogous consequences. And this brings us back to what is going to happen tomorrow, Liberation Day, tariffs. The United States is going to impose worldwide tariffs on its various trading partners. There are many, many countries that trade with the United States. Some of those countries are very vulnerable to the effect of these tariffs. I think they will be a major blow for countries like, say, Mexico. Britain, the extent to which Britain has tried to carve out exceptions for itself in terms of the tariffs which are coming, should be an indicator that Britain will be very hard hit by the sanctions indeed. The Germans are saying that sanctions are not going to do a great deal of harm to them because ultimately much of the income the German companies now receive is not from exports of goods manufactured in Germany itself, but rather from exports of goods manufactured by German companies in factories they have set up in the United States. My own view is that that is altogether too complacent. Germany is a major exporter. It's about to engage in a massive debt-fueled spending splurge, specifically on armaments and infrastructure spending. If it cannot export to the United States, given that its European markets are probably already in depression and demand there is falling, and given that its prospects of being able to export to other destinations such as Russia and China are diminishing, it seems to me very, very likely that with Germany unable to export goods directly from Germany to the United States, in a world of tariffs, systemic tariffs going all around the world, it seems to be more likely than not that we are going to see a rapid decline in Germany's trade surplus. And I, for one, given that we're going to see increased demand in Germany coming from this huge spending splurge, I don't see how that can avoid sucking in goods from outside, especially if the Germans are unwise enough to try to divert some of their industrial plant to making weapons and such things, which are both expensive and actually quite difficult to sell. I cannot imagine that imports will not rise into Germany, and I would not be surprised if in a couple of years' time we will start to see Germany start to run trade deficits. It always surprises people how rapidly countries can move from the position of being exporters to being importers, net importers. And I, for one, would not be surprised if in 2, 3, 5 years' time we start to see a new Germany with a debt to GDP ratio above 100%, well above 100%, with processes of deindustrialization continuing, because with high energy costs, German companies, industrial companies, particularly the big heavy industrial companies, will continue to be uncompetitive on global markets, and the new world of tariffs is going to make them even more so. And with Germany also running a trade deficit at the same time. In other words, in a couple of years' time, Germany's situation may not look that different from that of, say, Britain today. Just saying. So yes, these tariffs are going to affect many countries around the world. Some will perhaps be affected more than others. Some will be affected very little. India, as I said, as far as I'm aware, does not export very much to the United States. Its growth has generally been domestically driven. Russia is the same. Russia is a major exporter of raw materials, and increasingly now, by the way, also manufactured goods and also foodstuffs. But mostly it does not export. In fact, it exports to the United States itself hardly at all. So some countries will be less affected than other countries. But put all that aside, the biggest single exporter to the United States is, of course, China. Now, again, this is a point that is perhaps little talked about or understood, but as I understand it, the Chinese export something like $300 billion of finished goods to the United States every year, perhaps more. I suspect perhaps it is more, actually, but anyway, I'm not going to get into the numbers. And this increase in tariffs inevitably is going to affect those exports. It is intended primarily, first and foremost, to reduce these exports by China. Now, I suspect that China will be able, because its industries are so competitive and some of its goods are so advanced, I suspect it will be able to surmount some of these tariffs that the United States is imposing. It will probably find, it may be possible to find that some Chinese goods will continue to enter the United States. I'm talking about finished goods, despite the fact that the tariffs have been raised so high. They will still be competitive in American markets, despite the tariffs. But given everything else, given the hostility of so much of the political and economic class in the United States to China, and the perspective, the conception of China as an economic competitor and challenger of the United States and a rival for global primacy. If Chinese goods do start to enter the United States, to continue to enter the United States, despite the tariffs, I think other methods will be used to exclude them. There'll be sanctions, there will be claims that the Chinese are engaging in unfair practices. Chinese electric cars could find themselves restricted, for example. We've already seen what was done to Huawei, the mobile phone producer. We've seen what happened to TikTok. Whatever the Chinese do, however efficient their production is, however strong the demand in the United States from American consumers is for Chinese goods, some way will always be found in the United States to prevent these goods entering. And of course, what we are seeing as a result is the collapse of a globalized economic and trade system, which is the one that China exploited to its own advantage and which helped to make it the gigantic economic and industrial and trading power that it is today. But all of this taken together with the militarization of the relationship between China and the United States, which we are going to see, the intensifying rivalry between China and the United States, which has been getting more intense for at least the last 15 years, but which is likely to become significantly more intense from now on. It's the Chinese who will henceforth be the country within the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership that is likely to feel under the greater pressure. Now, of course, I've said this, I've outlined one possible future, the likely future, the way things seem to be playing out to me. There's always other possibilities. It could be that President Xi and President Trump are able to negotiate some kind of understanding with each other. President Trump has many times given indications that that would be his preference, and I think President Xi Jinping certainly would prefer some kind of understanding that can work to China's and America's mutual advantage, one which perhaps lowers China's trade surplus with the United States, but does so in a way that doesn't have major repercussions for the Chinese economy, and which at the same time successfully stabilizes relations. So, there are alternative futures. One can never be absolutely certain how things will turn out. But I have to say that the trends, the trajectory of travel, do not point in that more positive direction at the moment. At the current time, they point instead to a further aggravation in relations, a further intensification of rivalries. And that must be what the Chinese leadership is expecting. In fact, we know that that is what the Chinese leadership is expecting, because the media in China, which no doubt reflects the opinions of the Chinese leadership, is basically telling us this. And on this question, my understanding is that if you go to Chinese social media, which I cannot access directly, but I know many now who do, the sentiments there amongst the Chinese people, the Chinese netizens as they're called, the people who go onto Chinese media, social media, is the same. That they also now expect a worsening of relations with the United States, a significant worsening of relations with the United States, that they see the tariffs in that kind of way as a harbinger of a deterioration in the relationship between China and the United States, and the military build-up that the United States is engaging in the Pacific, as also pointing in that direction as well. And as we know, there is also a Chinese military build-up, the Chinese would say, in response to the American military build-up, which is also underway. Now, bear in mind also that there are growing indications now that we are rapidly moving towards a situation of global recession, that a major global recession is just over the horizon. In my opinion, this has long roots going back very, very far, though I've no doubt at all that when it comes, people will blame Donald Trump and his tariffs for causing it. But if there is a global recession, then the lesson of global recessions is that they too tend to lead to intensifying international tensions, increases in international tensions, as governments and countries maneuver for advantage in what is a very difficult economic landscape. So, this is, as I said, the situation the Chinese are confronting today. As I said, maybe, possibly, things will turn out right. Maybe Donald Trump will move to do that deal with Xi Jinping. There are people within his administration who I think would like him to. People like Vance and Gabbard, and it's my guess, Elon Musk and others who would like to move in that direction. But there can be no certainty that that will be the direction that will be followed, and more likely than not, it will not be. So, the Chinese have already had this meeting with the Japanese and the South Koreans. Now they're meeting with the Russians, and they're having a 3-day meeting with the Russians. Wang Yi, Xi Jinping's most important foreign policy aide and China's foreign minister, a man who is very close to Xi Jinping and who has Xi Jinping's complete trust, is now in Moscow. He's meeting with the senior Russian leadership. And I suspect that the reason he is there is to make sure that the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership remains in place. I, myself, do not believe that the Russians have any intention of downgrading it. I think that they see any attempt by the United States to try to separate them from China as a lure and a threat to themselves, ultimately. I don't believe the Russians have any plans to improve their relations with the United States at China's expense. And I certainly don't believe that the Russians have that much trust in the United States to do that. After all, as I have said, over the last 3 years, the Americans have, to all intents and purposes, waged a concealed war against them. Why should the Russians trust the Americans after such an extreme demonstration of hostility? Donald Trump, they undoubtedly think, Putin has said as much, is sincere about improving relations. But then there are others in the United States who undoubtedly take a different view. So this is the purpose of Wang Yi's visit to Russia, to Moscow. Now, I think that if anyone in the United States, in Washington, thinks that the Chinese are going to be deterred from buying Russian oil because Donald Trump is going to threaten China with higher tariffs, I think that they need to put that idea firmly to one side. I think that isn't going to happen. I think that the whole conception is completely wrong. It completely misjudges the importance of this relationship to China and Russia at this particular time. Now, as I said, they're all talking. They're each talking at the moment about how strong and good their relationship is. Lavrov, according to TASS, in his first meeting with Wang Yi, said this: "We recognize the responsibility of Moscow and Beijing to maintain close coordination in the international arena. The majority of countries perceive this as perhaps the most significant stabilizing factor during these challenging times in global politics. I am confident that today we will agree on how to build our bilateral relations in the context of preparations for the summit meetings, as well as on further coordination at the UN, its Security Council, within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, the G20 and ASEAN, and other multilateral platforms in the interests of building a more just and democratic multipolar world order. All rather wordy, but that at least is what Lavrov has said. And the Russians have been saying a lot more about the relationship and the way it's been moving forward. I'm not going to go through it all, but anyway, the overall position appears to be positive. The Russians and the Chinese are going out of their way to discuss how important their relations are to each other. I would just add this. I mean, this is something else that Lavrov said. We have noticed that you, dear Wang Yi, recently told media in Beijing that the comprehensive partnership and strategic cooperation between our countries is of a constant and not variable nature. This is exactly how our leaders, President Putin and President Xi, guide us. Most recently, during an online video conference, and prior to that, a telephone call, they once again could reaffirm their mutual commitment to the ongoing strengthening of the Russian-Chinese bond. We will apply all our efforts to ensure the effective execution of their agreements. And we've had comments from a Chinese expert, Mr. Bei Wenli, Deputy Director of the Center for Russian Studies at East China Normal University. Regardless of changes in the international situation, Chinese-Russian relations will progress undisturbed. The countries will contribute to each other's growth and revival, bring stability and positive energy to international relations. And he said this apparently after being asked a question about how China would respond to a possible thaw in US-Russia relations. And Mr. Bei Wenli then went on to say that the development strategies and foreign policies of both China and Russia are oriented towards a long-term perspective. The interaction between Beijing and Moscow has strong internal driving force and unique strategic value. Cooperation between China and Russia is not directed at any third party and is not subject to outside influence. So the last is, of course, a warning again to the Americans. Don't mess with this relationship. Don't think we will be put off from buying Russian oil because of anything that you do, and don't think that our Russian friends will compromise on the relationship because you make offers to them. And Mr. Bei then went on to say China, Russia and the United States are leading powers with significant international influence, and they should strengthen ties, mutual trust, and play a meaningful role in ensuring world peace and development. China is ready to work with all parties to create a balanced and stable foundation for relations between the powers and promote global strategic stability. So the Chinese, again, and the Russians saying to the Americans, look, we understand there are differences in our trading systems. We have our adversarial points, but there is no reason why we should be enemies. Don't treat us as enemies, and we won't treat you as enemies. We're always willing to sit down and talk things through with you and to find points of similarity and points of compromise. The people who are constantly making things more difficult than they need to be are yourselves, not us. And I think, as I said, that there are people in the administration who are open to this type of thinking, including conceivably even Donald Trump himself. So the Chinese and the Russians are not shutting the door on the United States, but nor are they assuming that the United States is going to be open to their overtures. And Wang Yi's visit to Moscow is to make sure that this relationship, to re-emphasize that this relationship remains firm. So anyway, there we are. That's China, Russia, still coming together. Putin himself, by the way, is also soon planning a trip to India, where he's been invited by Prime Minister Modi. Xi Jinping himself will be in Moscow in a few weeks to attend the Victory Day parade on Red Square on the 9th of May. And he will, of course, come with a strong delegation, and there will be detailed meetings and discussions with Putin and the other members of the Russian leadership. Other BRICS leaders, like President Lula of Brazil, will also be there. And they, too, undoubtedly will meet both with Putin and with Xi Jinping as well. In a few weeks' time, Moscow is going to be the international center of diplomacy, as all of the various countries, the big countries around the world, outside the West, come to Moscow to talk things over with each other. So, anyway, that's the situation between Russia and China. Now, what about the relations between the Russians and the Americans? What is happening to the way in which, to the discussions between the Americans and the Russians about bringing the Ukraine conflict to an end and even stabilizing our relations? Well, today, Putin's spokesman, Peskov, gave what I thought was a somewhat chilling perspective on where things are going. Peskov said this: "We are continuing our contacts with the American side. The topic is very difficult. The matters we are discussing are related to Ukraine resolution. They require a lot of additional effort." And he said this in response to questions about the threats of further sanctions on Russia if Russia doesn't simply capitulate to the Americans, to the American demands, and agree to this unconditional ceasefire, which the Russians clearly are not keen on agreeing to. Now, having said that, last night something did happen which has attracted some interest and commentary on from the commentariats of the two sides. Yesterday, there were no Uranium-2 drones attacking Ukraine, flying over Ukrainian airspace and attacking facilities and positions across Ukraine. And there were no Ukrainian drone attacks anywhere in Russia also. Now, there's been a lot of speculation that this pause, if it is a pause, is part of some kind of truce that has been arranged privately between the Americans and the Russians. Maybe. I have to say I'm less certain of this myself. I suspect that it's probably more connected with battlefield situations. The Russians, in particular, have been conducting intense attacks right across Ukraine for several weeks now, both with missiles and drones. An enormous amount of devastation has been done. And I would not be surprised if the Russians have paused their attacks basically in order to take stock and to see exactly what damage has been done and decide what further targets need to be attacked and such things. This is not a total story of an end of all attacks on Ukrainian cities. There were attacks, for example, on the city of Kherson, on the west bank of the Dnieper River, all of which, by the way, those attacks carried out by shorter range drones and missiles could be a sign that the Russians are planning some kind of amphibious operation in Kherson. Just saying. But anyway, there is speculation that this pause might be connected to some diplomacy. But I come back to this. For the moment, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of evidence of very intense contacts between the Americans and the Russians. There's lots of speculation that the two countries are in private discussions with each other, that Rubio and Lavrov talk to each other, that there's no public confirmation of this, that perhaps Waltz and Ushakov are speaking, and Witkoff and Ushakov might be speaking. Governments often maintain contacts with each other without publicizing that fact. But I have to say, my sense actually is otherwise. I get the sense that after the meeting in Riyadh about a week ago, about 10 days ago now, real intensive discussions between the Americans and the Russians have come to a stop. And, well, we see that Peskov doesn't seem to be at all optimistic of rapid progress moving forward. The topic is very difficult. The matters we are discussing are related to the Ukrainian resolution. They require a lot of additional effort. It's not a message that Donald Trump seems to be very keen on hearing, but it's been the consistent message that the Russians have been giving. On the battlefields, it is a completely different story. Here, we see more evidence of increasing Russian advances. Now, this morning, news came through that a village called Razlev has been captured in southwestern Donetsk region. This is an area where the Russians have been advancing consistently over the last couple of weeks. They recently captured Constantinople, clearing finally and conclusively the Andreevka fortified area. They moved beyond that now. They've captured Rozliv. The next target is apparently another rather larger settlement, maybe a small town called Bogatyr, which lies a little to the west. There's also reports that the Russians are continuing to advance rapidly towards Novopavlovka. Again, a rather bigger place than the average village in this area. Also, as I said, in southwestern Donbass. And Novopavlovka opens the way towards Dnipro. And apparently, there are no major fortified positions beyond it until the Dnieper itself is reached. This is what I hear. And apparently the landscape changes. It becomes much less heavily built up. There are more open fields. Armored vehicles can move more rapidly. And of course, that will depend on the condition of the Ukrainian defenses. But in this area, they continue to look extremely ragged. Now, elsewhere, there's also reports that the Russians have achieved a significant breakthrough west of the Oskol River, and that their bridgehead has now become very large, and in fact there are multiple bridgeheads across the Oskol River, extending all the way from Kupiansk basically to the Russian border, have started merging with each other, and that a very substantial force is now being established west of the Oskol River. Indeed, and of course, with the Russians now having established apparently a bridgehead that extends all the way to the Russian border, and apparently with roads connecting the Russian border to this bridgehead, the Russians should soon be in a position to send equipment and reinforcements to this bridgehead directly from Russia by road without having to transport this equipment across the Oskol River. Now, that is important because obviously there aren't many bridges in this area, and most of the bridges, I suspect, are pontoon bridges. They're probably not particularly strong. And of course, they're always vulnerable to Ukrainian attacks by drones or artillery or whatever. And if the Russians can supply their bridgehead directly from Russia, then of course the problems of transporting lots of goods and equipment and supplies across the river will have been dissipated, and this Russian grouping across the Oskol River will be in a strong position to do, well, none of us quite knows what. There is speculation that the Russians might move south towards Kupiansk, or conceivably they could move north towards Volchansk, or they could move west towards Kharkiv even. Nobody knows quite what. One of the advantages of establishing this big bridgehead is that you could, in theory, move in multiple directions at the same time. The same, by the way, applies to the Russian advance in southwestern Donbass, where, as I said, the Khortytsa group of the Ukrainian army is now being defeated. And obviously the Russians from there could move on towards Dnieper, if that is their plan, or they could move north to outflank Pakrovsk. They could do all kinds of different things. Now, the Ukrainians, for their part, have been trying to launch counterattacks in various places. They've launched a counterattack towards Chasiv Yar. There's lots of claims and reports in the Ukrainian media about the Ukrainians regaining positions in Chasiv Yar. They've launched counterattacks in the past in Tariffs, though those seem to have run their course and been reversed. The Ukrainians have been also launching counterattacks in the Pakrovsk area. There's endless claims about Kotlino, that Kotlino is either under Ukrainian control or under Russian control. The last report that I saw seemed to show Kotlino under Russian control, just saying. The Ukrainians have made many attempts to try to capture Pishanye and Shevchenko, these villages close to Pakrovsk. There's all sorts of speculations and explanations for these Ukrainian attacks and for the Ukrainian attacks in Belgorod, which, as far as I can tell now, seem to have run out of steam. I think that they have probably, well, I've already said what I consider to be the main explanation for them, that they're basically media operations intended to try to repair Zelensky's prestige after the disaster his forces have suffered in Kursk region. But the Russians are also saying that the other purpose of these attacks is to try to divert the Russians, to force the Russians to divert their forces from the major point their major points of advance, which is southwest Donbass, the Oskol River area, which I've just discussed, and the other area, which is the area close to the Zherebets River. Reports now say that the Russians are getting very close to the town of Liman, west of the Zherebets River, and that they're also attacking villages like Yampol and Troitske. The idea being to put the Russians in a position where they can launch attacks towards either Liman and ultimately Slavyansk, and perhaps to cut off the supplies to Ukraine's group in Siversk. All of these should be understood, I think, as preliminary moves in advance of the major offensive that the Russians intend to launch, probably in May. That is when I expect the major Russian forces to start moving, and that is when things will start to heat up properly on the battlefields. For the rest, despite this tantalizing piece of information about the fact that there were no mutual drone attacks over the course of last night, apart from that information, I see no actual sign of any movement of the situation in the diplomacy at all. Peskov, as I said, seemed to be take a bleak view about it, and there is no real sign, as far as I can see, that the Russians are giving ground, while Zelensky, for his part, continues to speak in ways that suggest that he remains committed to continuing the war. Now, over the last couple of days, a lot of attention has been focused on one particular remark that Zelensky made. He made what looked like a prediction that Putin would die soon. And he said that when that happens, all will be well. Now, been a lot of discussion as to what that means exactly. There was an article in the London Times, I think it was by Mark Galeotti, who said that it was just wishful thinking on Zelensky's part about the overall situation. He's gradually understanding that the walls are closing in on him, and he's looking for some kind of a miracle. He's 47 and Putin is 72, so perhaps he thinks that he's going to outlive Putin, though I have to say all of the indications are that Putin is in actually very good health and is vigorous and strong, and I see no reason to think that he's ready to die of natural causes anytime soon. Now, these commentaries always frustrate me because it's absolutely clear to me what Zelensky was doing. He was hinting again that the Ukrainians are looking for some way to assassinate Putin. We've had admissions from Ukraine that there have been multiple assassinations carried out by them of Russian and Donbass militia officials going back all the way to 2014. We've had long articles discussing all of this in the New York Times and the specific role, for example, that Kirill Budanov, Ukraine's military intelligence chief, has played in these attacks. We've also had Kirill Budanov's own admission some weeks ago that the Ukrainians have made several attempts already to assassinate Putin, though up to now these have been unsuccessful. I can guess what one of them was, by the way. I seem to remember that it was, I think in 2023, that a Ukrainian drone smashed into the Kremlin. Actually, the roof of the Kremlin was brought down on the roof of the Kremlin, doing minimal damage as far as I could see. But it seemed to be close to Putin's office. And it was clear to me at the time, and I remember saying so in a program that I made at the time, that this was an assassination attempt. It was an attempt to assassinate Putin whilst he was in his office, except, of course, that the drone didn't get through, and as it happens, Putin himself was not there. So what Zelensky is hinting at is that he thinks that soon the Ukrainians will get through and will succeed in assassinating Putin. Now, maybe Zelensky has reasons to think that, or there may be something else going on, which is that even though the Ukrainians are trying to assassinate Putin, maybe they have no actual means to assassinate Putin, but they want to create in Russia that sense of doubt, that sense of worry in Putin's own mind that he might indeed be assassinated. Over the last 24 hours, there's been rumors circulating on the internet, and I want to stress these are purely rumors. There's been no confirmation about this from any official Russian source, and the Russian media, the mainstream media in Russia, have not reported it. But there are lots of rumors that an Aurus limousine, Aurus is a Russian brand, it's the brand that provides the major limousines and cars used by not just the Kremlin, but by many members of the Russian elite. They can be bought privately. Anyway, there are reports that a limousine belonging to the Kremlin caught fire somewhere in Moscow, was burnt completely. There's no suggestion that there was anyone inside. It's not clear whether this was an explosion or not. Maybe some kind of a device was planted in it. That's what these reports appear to be hinting at. And anyway, there's said to be alarm and dismay in the Kremlin about this, despite all of the enormous security precautions that are being taken to protect Putin. I'm going to say straight away that I don't actually give any credence at all to this story. It has all of the looks to me of a story that's been intentionally planted, perhaps in order to give substance or to give support to, or weight, if you prefer, to Zelensky's words. And again, to sow doubt and worry in Russian minds about the safety of their president, and perhaps to cause Putin to worry about his own safety as well. So anyway, there's an awful lot of that going around in Kiev and on the internet. But to say it straightforwardly, when the leader of one country is dropping heavy hints that he wants to assassinate or achieve the assassination of the leader of another country, that does not seem to me to point to the first leader being in any way interested in a peace agreement or in achieving peace. If, of course, something like that were to happen to Putin, which heavens forbid, by the way, and if it were to be established that the Ukrainians were indeed involved in some way, then I cannot imagine that the Russians would agree under any circumstances to any kind of peace with Ukraine until the country had been subjugated And I cannot imagine, in that case, that any diplomatic initiatives by Donald Trump or anyone else would get anywhere at all. Anyway, there we go. That's what Zelensky is doing. And to repeat again, those words, those comments of his, together with his incredible performance a couple of days ago, about a week ago, posing in his office in front of paintings showing the Kremlin on fire and the sinking of the cruiser Moskva, they don't suggest to me a man whose mind in any shape or form is on peace. Now, since I've been talking about Zelensky, there has been a really excellent article, again by the British diplomat Ian Proud. You can find it on Substack, on his Substack blog, in which Ian Proud makes the point that all of these meetings that the European leaders have, in which they discuss Ukraine, the ones which are convened by Starmer and the ones that are convened by Macron, and sometimes, by the way, by Ursula as well, that we've had fewer of those. There is always one particular guest who is always invited, and that is Zelensky. And Zelensky comes along, and he always turns up in his trademark costume, and always demanding more sanctions against Russia, more money and weapons for Ukraine, preaching his endless narrative of no compromise. And when he comes to these meetings, inevitably, Zelensky's rhetoric, which no one is prepared to challenge head on, none of the European leaders is prepared to challenge it head on, inevitably comes to dominate the discourse of these meetings. Everybody ends up repeating these incredibly belligerent Zelensky talking points, because nobody can put themselves in a position of pushing back on them. And I'm going to say, over the last couple of days, I've got a clearer sense of what happened at the very last meeting, the one that Macron convened about a couple of days ago in Paris. And of course, Zelensky was indeed there. And it's now become clear that the meeting was a complete failure. The British and the French and one or two stalwart allies still want to talk about sending troops to Ukraine, but no one else wanted to hear this. In fact, it appears that behind the scenes, off camera, there was an awful lot more dissension and even some rows as various European leaders started to push back. People apparently are becoming increasingly fed up with this belligerent language from Macron and Starmer, and are telling them that enough's enough. They're not prepared to put up with this much longer. My own guess is that far from the coalition of the willing growing in size, the way that Starmer and Macron want to pretend, it is actually shrinking. Now, I say all of this, perhaps Macron and Starmer quietly, or maybe the people who run them quietly, think that it's already done its job. It's made it more difficult for the Americans and the Russians to agree ceasefire terms. It's given Zelensky the public backing he needs, because the Americans, sorry, the British and the French and the other European hardliners do not want to see a ceasefire in Ukraine. They do not want the war in Ukraine to end. Now, my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou has recently published a post on X, and he made a point also on our latest video when we discussed all this question on the Duran. And the point he makes, going back to that New York Times article, is that the impression that the article gives is of a Russian army that is bungling, inefficient, and incompetent, of American generals who are superb professionals who, left to themselves, will be beating the Russians sideways, and of wonderful American plans which always fail, not because the Russians are able to push back, but because the Ukrainians themselves spoil things. They come and they take these great plans and they make a mess of them. I'm going to read Alex's post about this on X, Twitter X. NYT article admits that this was more than proxy war between the United States and Russia. It was as close as could be to an all-out hot war between the two sides, US and Russia. NYT, however, is running cover for the Biden administration. When you read through this very long article, the conclusion is that the Biden administration and US military command were easily defeating Russia until, one, the Ukrainian generals started acting up and disobeyed US orders. two, Zelensky chased big wins for PR reasons, failing to follow US strategy. three, resulting in the 2023 counteroffensive failure, trust was broken between the US and Ukraine. four, what followed was the US keeping Ukraine in the game up to the US elections by striking targets in Crimea and pre-2014 Russia. five, Trump entered the White House and decided to wind the war down, handing Russia the win. So it was all ultimately Ukraine's fault, not the Russians fighting back or out generally the Americans, as I said in my programs, but rather the Ukrainians constantly screwing up and making a failure of these wonderful plans they were given. And Alex continues, history is written by the victors. In this case, the New York Times has decided that the US under Biden was victorious, if not for the insubordinate Ukrainian generals and ego of Zelensky. Trump will be blamed for the end result, capitulation. The article 100% explains why NATO and the Europeans still believe that they can win this war. Peak delusion and propaganda. In other words, they're being told, they're telling themselves all the time, it's not because the Russians are good and strong and getting stronger. It's because the Ukrainians won't do as they're told. Otherwise, the Russians are simply crap. If European troops were to go into Ukraine, if the Europeans were to deploy forces to Ukraine, if the Americans were to back them directly, taking us finally into World War III, why the entire Russian military would simply collapse. Now, I think that's right. I think that is exactly what the thinking is in Brussels, in Paris, and in London. Matt Taibbi, who has another brilliant piece, by the way, about the New York Times article, essentially makes the same point. And he fixes on a specific comment of one of these American generals, General Cavalli, who says that The point is not to bring the Ukrainians up in training them up to the superlative American standards. Oh, no, that would be impossible. That would be expecting altogether too much. Rather, it is to bring them up beyond the even lower level of the Russians. There's another article, by the way, today in the Daily Telegraph by my old friend Hamish de Breton Gordon, who basically repeats all of this. He also speaks of the Russians as untrained, cowardly, incompetent, bungling. It's all there, still in that article. Until this illusion finally dissipates, it's likely that we will still find politicians in the West, in London and Paris and Berlin, in Brussels as well, who will continue to propagate this myth that victory in Ukraine remains possible because the Russians, you see, aren't really any good at all. I have to say, when Alex made this point to me, it reminded me immediately of books that I'd been reading long ago, I haven't read them for a long, long time, written by various German generals and officers about the German army's failures on the Eastern Front in the Second World War. Always, the Germans were far better than the Russians. The only reason why the Germans lost against the Russians, apart from the fact that there were more Russians than Germans, which, by the way, was not true, or by things like the Russian winter, which is also an exaggerated story. The reason the Germans ultimately lost was not because the German generals weren't any good, or because the German army was, not superb, or because the Russians fought well and had brilliant generals also. Rather, it was because of these factors: Russian superiority, the Russian winter, and the irrational and crazy orders of the mustachioed man in Berlin. Suffice to say that one of the books I most remember and finding out, and in the end, so mendacious that I just stopped reading it, by a German general called Manstein, was actually entitled Lost Victories. Well, what did you get in this New York Times article, if not exactly the same thing? It was all lost victories. All we need to do is just to go on keeping the war going a little longer, sort out the Ukrainians at last, put some of our own troops in, and victory will be ours. In the meantime, the Russians and the Chinese are meeting. Tariffs loom. Depression stalks Europe. Some people still cling on to their illusions, but I doubt for very long. Anyway, that's the end of my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget also that you can support our, that if you like this video, you can tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.